Hello and welcome to the Field Guides. I'm Bill and I'm here with Steve. Good evening, Steve.
Good evening, Bill.
What we're going to do today, and over the course of many future episodes, is give you the experience of what it's like to be in the woods, in the field, and on the trail. Each month, we pick a natural history topic, research the science behind that topic, and then get you out to a natural spot and share with you everything that we've learned.
Well, that, or have a professional do the heavy lifting for us.
Yeah, we've been slacking lately.
Yeah, so all that is to say we do have a special guest on this episode, but I want to throw in there really quick that, don't worry, we will go back to doing our old style of episode soon enough, where Bill and I stumble through topics we don't personally work or publish in. But for now, you're just going to have to put up with the expert. I'm so sorry, guys.
So last month we had Wayne Gall take us out and search for the devil crayfish. And this month, what do we have lined up?
We have Mike Serviss from New York State Parks, Recreation, and Historical Preservation taking us out to go see the hart's tongue fern at Clark Reservation State Park.
That's right, and the hart's tongue fern is a very endangered and rare fern. Definitely worth checking out.
Yeah.
So this episode with Mike came out of our relationship with New York State Parks. Regular listeners will know that there have been 2 episodes in the past that we've done with park employees. Now, these folks aren't park rangers. They're actually researchers and field technicians, people that are doing environmental field work as part of New York State Parks. So we did 1 episode in the past on...
local ecotypes.
That's right. Yeah. And then we also did an earlier one on restoring grassland habitat. Mm-hmm. So you don't have to listen to those previous 2 ones to appreciate this episode, but I think they were great ones. Go back and listen to them if you haven't already.
Yeah, it's like our New York State Parks trilogy.
That's right, yeah. But there'll probably be more.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. And I do have to say before we get into it that ferns for me, and I think for you, it's not one of our great specialties.
It's always been one I wanted to get into because I think in our area we only have like 100 species. So I'm like, you could do that. That would be easy enough to tackle. Yeah. But I never got into it. I mean, I never got into it so deeply that I feel super confident around ferns. Yeah.
And I do have to say that ferns for me, when I started to get into natural history, they were something that didn't entice me in the way that wildflowers did or trees. And there was a teacher in college that both of us had. We've mentioned him before, Sandy Geffner, but he had a deep and abiding passion and still does for ferns. And whenever he would have us out in the field and we stumble on some ferns, there was a lot of eye rolling, sometimes me included, because we knew the next 40 minutes we were going to be sitting in one spot talking about that fern.
Yeah, I do love that about Sandy. You can go to the most beautiful place to go hiking during one of his classes, and he'll make it like 15 feet in a 3-hour and 50-minute class or whatever.
Not that that's necessarily a bad thing.
No, it was great. It was great. I loved it.
That's a Sandy hike. Yeah. But I do have to say that over the years, I've come to realize that ferns, they're like the ducky of the plant world.
What are you talking about? What does that mean?
That's an older reference. Those of you that, like me, in their 40s, if you ever saw Pretty in Pink, Ducky was the best friend that the main character didn't realize was the perfect choice standing there all along.
Yeah.
So ferns, they're just there. They're usually not... standing out the way those wildflowers are, the trees are. People walk by them, those are ferns. But
they're the best girl, yeah.
So Mike, he really just firmed that up for me, that this idea that ferns have so much to offer if you're willing to stop, take a look, and really get to know them. Mm-hmm. They just have that awesome life cycle that Mike will go into that's just not typical for most of the plants we find in our northeastern woods.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's cool stuff. All right, now before we get into the episode proper, Steve does have a special announcement.
Yeah, so this is a special episode because we have a sponsor.
Woohoo!
So a few months ago, Bill and I were approached by Jack from Gumleaf USA. This company makes high-quality, super comfortable, handmade tall rubber boots. And I was actually able to meet up with Jack, and he gave us a pair of his Royal Zip model to try out for ourselves. Now, I've done a lot of field work, especially in wetlands, and I've had to wear a lot of different rubber boots, but these are easily the most comfortable boots that I've had.
Very comfy.
Yeah, they're super nice.
A lot of nice little bells and whistles.
What?
Well, for the average rubber boot, it's pretty basic, where these have, a nice gusseted zipper. It has these clips up at the top that firm it up nicely.
Yeah. So they're really, really easy to slip on, and even with that zipper there, they're still 100% waterproof. There's nothing to worry about. It's super nice. But overall, it is a pretty simple design. They're handcrafted for comfort and function, but I actually think they look pretty good, too.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So like I said, they're 100% waterproof, they're durable, and they're made from 85% natural rubber, so you don't really have to worry about them cracking. They have styles for men, women, and children, and they're great for birding, I think especially botanizing even.
And I can't wait until the summer so I can use them when we're bird banding, because walking through that tall grass at dawn, it's so wet. It'll be great for keeping things dry, and it also will keep the ticks out.
Yeah. And really, they're going to be good for any outdoor activity. So if you're interested in a high-quality, tall rubber boot, we definitely recommend visiting gumleafusa.com and exploring their products. It's also a great way to support us, and it'll actually help us to do cooler things in the future with the podcast.
Yeah, so thank you to Jack for reaching out to us.
Yep, and we'll have a link in the episode notes, and also we'll have a clickable logo on our website for you guys to check out too.
And a couple weeks ago, I happened to have them in the back of my car, and I was meeting some of my college students out for a field trip. It was about a 40-degree kind of wintry day, and I had one genius show up at the field trip wearing sneakers and no socks. So I made him put on the boots, and by the end of the hike, he did say they were some of the most comfortable boots he'd ever worn.
Good.
All right, so with that, folks, we are going to start the episode proper, and we hope you enjoy getting to meet Mike Serviss and the Hart's-Tongue Fern. Well, Mike, thank you so much for giving up a Saturday morning to come out here with us.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Happy first day of fall.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
The autumnal equinox.
Yeah.
So we are out here on a nice, cool fall day, finally.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's actually quite comfortable out here. And Mike, I think a good way to start is to give the listeners an idea of your background. How did you end up standing in these woods with these two goofballs in front of you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There could be a long story here. I guess I'll start with I was a bit of a late comer to the game of being in the environmental field. I was working at a bank and worked like random desk jobs for a while. I was working at a medical device company actually, and just wasn't really fulfilled. So I started volunteering at the Utica Zoo. I'm from the Utica area, and really got into conservation from that. And decided to go to the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry for conservation biology. And from there, it just kind of naturally progressed into love of all things plants and like plant ecology and plant propagation. And I just kind of fell into this project with the American Hart's-Tongue Fern with Dr. Danny Fernando's lab over at SUNY ESF. And it became my master's project for when I started doing my master's, and then I started working for state parks through that, and now I'm still working for state parks 4 years later. So that's why I'm here.
How old were you when you made the switch from all your previous life to your life in the woods?
Yeah, the past life to now. I was about 26 years old.
Okay.
So came back as a non-traditional student. That was about 8 years ago or so. Yeah.
That's very similar to my story. I think I switched over at about 20, and I only just went back to my master's program now in plant physiology. So
yeah. I guess the message is it's never too late, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Good. All right, so it sounds like you kind of had a dream trajectory of you came out of school and it doesn't sound like you had a hard time finding a job.
No, not really. So I was working at ESF, doing teaching assistant thing, and my master's research brought me here because of, obviously we have so many populations of Hart's-Tongue ferns right here, and it's just 10 minutes down the road from SUNY ESF. So I started working here in the summers as a seasonal, and then about a year and a half, 2 years ago, they brought me on full time because I guess they like me.
So at that time, did you have a perception of, wow, I'm really lucky to, because it's just it's a cliche, but it's true that it can be very difficult.
Oh, yeah.
To find a position.
Yeah, it's a super competitive field. Yeah. Anything related to the environment, especially around here with the forestry school right next door. There's so many students coming out every year that are highly qualified. It's a really great school. So there's a lot of competitiveness. So it was nice to just kind of fall into a thing, especially something I love to do so much. It's a really great job.
And you said that you were doing work with the Hart's-Tongue Fern with your graduate work?
Right.
So was that something that you went into, that you were interested in, or was it more something that an advisor recommended?
Yeah, so I did like the double dip thing where I did my undergrad and my grad work at SUNY ESF, and I learned of the project as an undergrad with Dr. Fernando there, and kind of becoming familiar with the project, I thought it was really interesting, and a reintroduction project. I love working in the field, but I also like to mix it up, do some lab work, some greenhouse work, some stuff like that. I get bored doing the same thing over and over again. So it seemed like an ideal fit because it brought me into the lab, it brought me into the greenhouse, it brought me into the field, and I got to do all these interesting things as a result. So, yeah.
Well, I bet there's a lot of people listening out there that are envious of your position right
Yeah. They're probably not envious of my paycheck. But, but I do love my job, so that's the most important thing.
That is, for sure. One little anecdote that I'll share is Steve and I in college, we went at different times, but we had one of the same teachers was Sandy Geffner. We've mentioned him on Mike before. And I'll always remember he has a passion for ferns. Some people find that passion overwhelming in terms of how much time he'll spend talking about ferns on a given hike, right? But I remember him telling us once that not many people know a lot about ferns. So if you ever want to pick an area where you will be the expert in almost any group that you're in, choose ferns, because even if you just do a little bit of work in learning about ferns, you're going to know more than about 90% of the people out there.
Yeah, that's definitely a good point. You could probably say the same about fungi.
Yeah.
You could probably say the same specifically in plants. Yeah, fungi, lichens. You could probably say that about mosses too. There's very few moss experts.
Right.
I was lucky enough to have a moss expert on my committee for my graduate program, Robin Kimmerer, who's a pretty famous biologist. Yeah. And so that was fantastic. I still don't really know much about mosses aside from their life cycle. And
I mean, she's also one of the go-to authors for mosses, right? Just for the layperson as well, yeah.
Yeah, she's spectacular.
And I don't want the listeners to think I'm talking down about these different areas, because I would say when I started out as an interpretive naturalist, I would kind of avoid those things because I had that bias that, these things are boring. And I think most of that comes from me not knowing a lot about them, but spending time with people who do know about them. I mean, they have just as interesting stories to tell as anything else that's out here. It's just most people don't know about them. They haven't taken the time to learn about them.
It's true. And fern identification can be pretty hard because sometimes it's just the smallest details that differentiate one species from another.
Sure.
And like in the case of the genus Dryopteris, the wood ferns, they hybridize a lot too.
Right.
So it's like you're looking at a fern and you're like, what am I looking at? Like, what is this? They keep you on your toes, you know?
You get that with wildflowers too. Try to identify a violet, right?
Right.
Right?
True.
So, but I would say that for the lay person out there who may be thinking of, I want to learn more about ferns, you definitely can identify ferns by general groups.
Yeah.
Right? Certain things you can look at and you can say, well, I know that's a wood fern, right? Or I know that's in the spleenwort group, or right?
Yeah, absolutely. So wood ferns, you'll typically find scales at the bases of the stipes or the bases of the stems, and they're kind of those like highly segmented or fragment, I don't know what's the right term, divided would be the right term.
Sure.
Highly divided kind of ferns that I mean, we can look at, we've got a wood fern right here in front of us.
Oh, look at that, it's right at our feet.
Yeah.
Now tell me if I'm right. So again, I don't know a ton about ferns. I can ID the Christmas fern and the sensitive fern, but when I look down, I pretend that I know what I'm talking about if I have a group out and they say, what kind of fern is this? I'll say, well, if there's scales on the stipe, right?
Yep.
And it's divided, the leaves are readily divided, it's probably a wood fern. Am I making that up, or?
You're probably correct.
Okay.
Yeah. Depending on where you are, like in this park, most ferns that look like this are going to be wood ferns. So if you were just like, it's a wood fern, you'd probably be right. Yeah. Even by accident. Yeah. So the scales on the bottom of the stipe or at the base of the stipe is usually a good indicator that you're looking at a wood fern, for example.
Okay.
All right. It's nice to know that I'm not spreading misinformation.
Yeah, definitely. And for this particular fern, there's other features that you can use to identify it that are sometimes very intuitive. So we can see here, so ferns we know produce spores as opposed to seeds like flowering plants or gymnosperms. So on the underside of the frond, we can see where the spores are produced in a structure called a sorus. And these ones tend to be marginal, or on the margins of the leaflets here. Yep. Actually, this one isn't displaying it very well, but they're right on the edges here, and this would be Dryopteris marginalis, or the marginal shield fern, or marginal wood fern.
Yep. I've heard of that. And again, for the listeners, sometimes the spores you're going to find them on separate fertile fronds, right?
Correct. Yeah. That's an important identification characteristic as well. They're not always on the actual vegetative frond. Right. They are sometimes on completely separate structures that look totally different than the rest of the fern. They're called fertile fronds or fertile stalks.
Right.
Yeah.
So like the sensitive fern.
Sensitive fern does that. Ostrich fern, cinnamon fern. Yeah, a lot of different ferns do that.
Yeah, and I think it's good that we're going over some basics because this is the first episode we've ever done with ferns, right?
Yeah, I think we've mentioned them briefly. I think we've seen cinnamon fern, maybe an Allegheny or something, but we haven't really talked about ferns.
So this is good. All right. So you gave us some background on yourself. Could you give us a little background on the site, Clark Reservation, where we are?
Yeah, so this is Clark Reservation State Park. We're in Jamesville, New York, just southeast of Syracuse, New York. And this is a really interesting park. It was originally purchased, the land around it was purchased by Mary Clark Thompson in 1915. And she was the daughter of a former governor of New York, Myron Clark. And she originally bought the land around Glacier Lake, which is the lake here, because she was interested in geology. And geology is a really important aspect of this park. It's all limestone, dolomitic limestone, and has a lot of cliffs and ravines and things like that. And that's really important for our plant communities here because it provides an array of different microclimates. So very cool, shady areas, very sunny ridges. So we have a lot of different plant diversity because of that. But the interesting connection with Mary Clark Thompson is that she had purchased this land and donated it to New York State. It became a state park officially in 1926. And she also built greenhouses that are currently owned by New York State Parks or operated by New York State Parks in Canandaigua, New York, called Sonnenberg Gardens, which you guys previously filmed a podcast on local ecotypes at Sonnenberg Gardens. So it's an interesting connection.
She keeps popping up.
Yeah, that was her summer home, and this was she loved geology, and that's why she purchased the land here. Just so happened to have some very rare and currently endangered species in it. Yeah.
So I don't know if we mentioned it in the intro, but the fern that we are looking for today, the hart's tongue fern, is a threatened species, right? Or is it endangered now?
So federally, it's threatened. State, it's endangered.
Okay.
Got it.
All right. So has that been recently upgraded?
Yeah, so just last year it was upgraded from state threatened to state endangered.
Oh, yeah, because we were looking at the New York Natural Heritage Program website, and it needs to be updated then.
Yes, they come out with a report every year or so, or I think 5 years actually.
Okay.
So Steve Young, the chief botanist for New York State, comes out with a report, and the last one was October 2017, so about a year ago now, and it was updated on that report. Okay. So yeah, their website's a little behind on that. But, yeah.
Either way, it's in trouble.
Yeah. So yeah, it's definitely, and one thing that I think is important is not to confuse rare with endangered. So some things are inherently rare, but they're not necessarily at risk. So the hart's tongue fern is rare, but the reason why it's threatened or endangered is more because of habitat loss and loss of population decline over periods of time. So it's not just that it's rare that equates to it being endangered. It more has to do with its losses over time.
So can you give people an idea of its current status in terms of where you're going to find it, what are population levels at?
Yeah, so where you're going to find it in New York State is only in 2 counties. You're going to find it in Onondaga and Madison counties. In New York State, we're currently in Onondaga County.
And Madison
is our neighboring county.
So pretty much just in this area in New York State, around Syracuse.
Right, within like a 60-mile span along the thruway or so.
Okay.
So it actually exists along the Niagara Escarpment. And this is like the Onondaga portion of the Niagara Escarpment that goes all the way through where you guys are.
I was going to say, we got one of those.
Yeah. I believe it historically was in the Niagara Gorge out that way. Or there's records of it being there. And then it goes up through Canada, through Ontario, and there's several hart's tongue fern populations up in Ontario. That's probably where they're doing the best, is up there. And then it actually connects with the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where there's also about 11 or so populations of hart's tongue ferns.
And we were talking about this before we turned on the mic. As Steve and I were driving up, the information we read said that 90% of hart's tongue fern populations are in New York State, but then you corrected that.
Yeah, so it used to be that within the United States, I should say, because they have significant populations in Canada.
Okay.
But within the United States, New York used to be able to make the claim that we had about 92% of all the harts-tongue fern in the United States. But within the last couple of years, they found a population in Michigan that's several thousand strong. So that number significantly dropped. I don't know exactly what it is. But we do have a claim to fame for state parks in New York State, in that between Clark Reservation State Park and nearby Chittenango Falls State Park in Madison County, we have 94 to 95% of all the harts-tongue ferns in New York State.
Wow.
So we have a big responsibility for taking care of them here at the parks. Yeah.
So a lesser claim to fame, but still a claim to fame, really.
Yeah.
Right. All right, so let's go see it.
Yeah, let's check it out. It's just over this way. Watch the poison ivy.
Yeah.
Lots of it around here.
Holy cow, there's a lot of it.
Uh-huh.
All right.
So yeah, we're here. This is so recently there's a guy on Instagram. He's at New York State Botany or New York Botany, and his name's Scott, and I've brought him out here before to see these, and he came out recently. I saw him, he posted some photos of this, and he referred to, I think he had the best description of this population. He called it the juiciest harts-tongue fern population in New York, which I thought was pretty accurate. So
put that on the brochure.
Yeah, so this is definitely one of the most impressive populations of harts-tongue ferns that you'll find. It's definitely in New York State. You might find other ones in Canada that are more impressive than this, but these plants are larger than any other harts-tongue ferns that I've ever seen. And you can see they just kind of it's almost like a monoculture of them up there, like this one spot.
So let's give people a visual. So folks, we're standing kind of in a hollow, like one side is a steep incline going up, what would you say, 200 feet maybe?
Yeah, mossy,
maybe
rocky incline.
And then we're standing kind of hip deep in ferns.
Yeah, Goldie's wood ferns is what these are.
Oh, great. And then it's the very mossy woods here. And then up on the slope above us is just this big cluster of harts-tongue ferns. So why don't you give people, because again, I don't know if we went over this in the intro, but give people, what does the harts-tongue fern look like?
Yeah, that's a really great thing. So I love this plant, and one of the reasons why I love it is because it's so unique looking. It almost looks like something you would find in the tropics.
Right.
Yeah.
It's got an undivided frond, or a simple frond, which means it just looks like a strap almost. It kind of looks leathery, like you can see they're kind of shiny here. And earlier in the season, they'll be like this bright, like wintergreen color when they first pop out, and they look amazing. Actually, about May or June is my favorite time to see them. But this is also spectacular looking at them here. But yeah, they're just these clumps of straps, like almost like green straps coming out of the thing. And so the American harts-tongue fern, I should specify we're talking about the American variety here.
Right.
The American harts-tongue fern, if you dissect the name, so a hart is actually a red deer, or a term used for a red deer. Some hunters might know that, but it's not commonly known term.
Right.
And
Steve
harts,
didn't know.
Yeah,
No, I didn't know. And it is spelled differently, right? It's not H-E-A-R-T?
Right.
Right, H-A-R-T. And it's actually like an English term, which is probably why, because there's a European harts-tongue fern that's common in England. This is a totally separate subspecies that we have here, genetically different, morphologically different, all that. So the hart-tongue is in reference to the shape and the appearance of the frond, which looks like just a really big deer tongue, basically.
Like a really long deer tongue.
Yeah. It's really cool. So yeah, it's a really interesting plant. Like if you see it, you'll definitely know like that's different.
Right.
Like that's not something you would normally see, and you might not even think it's a fern.
I was just thinking that.
Yeah.
Like people who maybe don't know a ton about ferns, they would see that and not necessarily say, oh, that's a fern.
Yeah. So you look at these Goldie's wood ferns in front of us, and you see this is clearly a fern.
Right.
Like you feel like you're in the Triassic era, standing in these. They're big old ferns, and they look like what you'd expect a fern to look like.
Right.
But then you look right next to it with that harts-tongue fern there, and it's like, you could almost. I know people have mistaken them for even like some kind of sedges or some kind of lilies.
I was about to say with the sedges, I think if I looked really quick, for the first half second that I was looking up there, I'd be like, oh, that's maybe a bunch of plantain-leaved sedge.
Yeah,
and then,
that's what I was thinking.
And then if I looked another second or two, I'd be like, oh, wait a second. Although they are wavy, similar to how the plantain-leaved sedge is a little wavy like that. But, it's different enough to, I don't think you would get confused for too long.
It doesn't fit the usual search image for a fern.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And then if you were to go up and inspect it, if you flip the frond over and look at it, I don't know, do you want to step
let's
over
do it.
here? And
So we're actually
check
heading
it out.
towards a lighter green individual. Do you think that's just a trick of the lighting, or is that actually a lighter green than the other ones on the slope there?
I think it's probably about the same color as the ones on the slope. I think they just look darker because, I don't know, it's just so dramatic.
Right,
in this
right.
area. You know,
Okay.
like these habitats are all so dramatic. So, yeah, if you were to come up here and then flip over the frond, you'll see. So the scientific name for these is Asplenium, scolopendrium, variety americanum. And what scolopendrium refers to is actually the appearance of the sori, or where the spores are produced here, to that of a centipede.
Okay.
Because scolopendrium is derived from centipede in Greek or Latin. I can't remember which one. But so that's how it gets its name. It's from that, and it's a spleenwort, so hence the Asplenium genus.
Yeah, so these are very linear sori then, right?
Correct.
Yeah, because usually in my head when I think of sori, turn them over and you're going to see round.
Right.
Often, not always.
Sometimes round, sometimes kidney bean shaped,
Yes.
but usually don't think of them as being so long and stretched out like these ones
so
are.
each of them on the back, you would say what is about 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch long, or a little bit shorter.
Yeah, I'd
especially as
say
you get up near the tip.
It's about maybe a centimeter and a half,
Okay.
or so. Yeah.
All right.
So
shorter than I'm
so
talking.
yeah, it'd be about maybe 1/2 inch too.
And I have to take issue with the centipede reference. I'd say it definitely looks more like a caterpillar. Don't you think?
Which one has more legs, millipedes or centipedes?
Millipedes.
I don't know. I think millipede more than centipede. 'Cause
Okay.
aren't their legs more exposed than centipedes? Centipedes are usually like under their body, where millipedes can be out a little bit.
You have it opposite.
Yeah, the other way around.
Yeah, see, this is why.
That's why you're not a taxonomist, right?
Yeah.
But either way, they're definitely distinctive.
Yes.
Yeah, would you say so?
Quite. Yeah, quite. And so one way we can tell the difference between the American variety and the European variety is typically on the European variety, these sori, where the spores are produced, would go from the tip of the frond and all the way down even to the base here.
Okay.
Where in American hart's-tongue fern, we rarely find them going more than halfway or 3/4 of the way down. So it's a good morphological feature. You might see on a younger European one where they'll go maybe 3/4 of the way down.
Okay.
But it's a good distinctive feature of them.
We did see reference to that in what we were reading on the way here, that the spore bodies only go about halfway down or a little farther than that.
Yep.
But they didn't compare that to the European one.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a good.
Yep.
Yeah. So is the European one fairly widespread? Could you find that around here?
So that's an interesting question.
Okay.
So I have one on my desk at work. Yeah.
Well, we did find, honestly, when we looked it up online, most of the things that came up were nurseries
Yes.
selling.
Probably
varieties.
They have the European variety.
Right.
Most of what's commercially available. So one of my office mates at ESF in school was doing genetics work for it, and he was comparing it with commercially available varieties with the American hart's-tongue fern. And the commercially available ones are almost always of European genetic origin. There's an interesting thing with this particular population with the genetics also. So they found this is the most genetically diverse population, and like significantly more so than any other hart's-tongue fern population that was sampled throughout its range.
Wow.
And it has a lot of genetics in common with the European hart's-tongue fern. So there's a few different theories as to why that is, and also why they're so much bigger than most of the other hart's-tongue ferns we find. So when they did sampling, they did a transect through, and they found that the ones on the outside, more outsides of the transects, so on either side of this main clump here, were more American looking in the genetics, and the ones toward the middle, as you moved closer, got more and more European in their genetic makeup. So it's thought that at some point, someone may have actually planted European hart's-tongue fern out here, because that was common to do back in like the early 1900s, before we knew too much about, genetic swamping and hybrids and all that kind of stuff. And so it's thought that it's possible. We don't know for sure, but it's possible that some of these in here are hybrids, which would explain their larger size also.
Sure.
And they do tend, on these ones, not this one in particular that I'm looking at, but they do tend, the sori, to go a little further down the frond in this population than they do in most of the other populations.
Okay. Interesting.
So there's kind of like, some air of mystery to this population. That
They might have a little European in them.
We know they've got a little European in them. Yeah. But how it got there and what it really means, that's up for debate still.
Wow.
So I want to just say something about the morphology. So I was kind of worried that we read that at the base of the frond, at the base of this strap-like thing, there was going to be a heart-shaped base to it. And I'm glad that it's not really all that heart-shaped. It actually looks much more like one of those little plastic things that you close your loaf of bread with. Right? Do you know what I'm talking? Yeah. So I was just worried that there would be some confusion with, like hearts, like the base is heart-like, but it's not. It's more like it pinches off a loaf of bread that you're trying to keep fresh. So, but it is interesting, the base of it there.
Yeah. Again, not typically fern-like.
Definitely. So there's another fern that we have in decent amounts of here. It's fairly rare, though, throughout most of its range, is the walking fern.
Okay.
So Asplenium rhizophyllum. And those are really interesting. They're a relative of hartstongue fern, probably the closest one that we have here in the park. And they are much smaller, but they also have a base kind of like that. But what they do is they're much smaller, but they grow out the tips really, really, really long and plant them back in the soil, and then they sprout a new fern from that. So that's how they call it the walking fern. Yeah. So that's probably the closest relative and the best indicator species for hartstongue fern that I know of. If you find walking fern around, you're more likely to find hartstongue fern around.
Okay.
And that's something that I actually used when I was looking for areas to transplant these. I guess getting into a project that I was working on for my master's was a reintroduction project, and we used the GIS models, the habitat models, and expert opinion and our knowledge of the area, but also just going around and finding in the park and places we wanted to put them where walking fern was growing was not a bad indicator of where they might also grow. Yeah.
Let's stand up.
Now, what did you say the species name for walking fern was again?
It's Asplenium rhizophyllum.
The walking part has nothing to do with the rhizome.
No, but so what it actually means is like planting leaf.
Oh.
So phylum being the leaf, or phylum being the leaf, and rhizo meaning like planting, like a rhizome,
and
like a stem. Yeah.
For listeners who don't know, what is a rhizome?
So a rhizome is an underground stem that is typical of most ferns, and also how a lot of ferns tend to spread. Like these glade ferns that we have behind us have really extensive rhizome systems. So what you're actually seeing when you see a fern is the above ground leaves, but they all will typically have an underground stem. That would be more analogous to what you think of like a tree trunk or something like that. So that's their main source of where they store their starches and carbohydrates and all that good stuff, and then they shoot up the leaves from under the ground.
So you mentioned your project, your reintroduction project you were doing. Have we talked much yet about the habitat requirements of hartstongue?
Yeah,
we've mentioned it a little bit, but
not much. No. Yeah. So when you guys were talking earlier about the slope and how steep it is and everything, so there's a lot of great research done on this in the early 90s by a professor at ESF called Don Leopold. He was on my committee as well. He wrote the book on trees in the Northeast.
Another notable author.
He's very well known. Yeah, I had a lot of conservation all stars on my team. It was pretty intimidating.
You were in the right place, right?
Yeah, but it was very helpful in the long run. Really intelligent folks, but he did a lot of research on the habitat requirements for hartstongue fern in the late 80s, early 90s. And what we're actually looking at here is what we'd call a talus slope. So, and then above it would be a calcareous cliff. So what happens is over time, rocks will fall off of the cliff and build up at an angle here. And then eventually organic matter, leaves, everything will fill it in, so you get somewhat thin soils, but really nutrient-rich soils. And hartstongue fern absolutely love calcium and magnesium, which is what is in this limestone. That is what these cliffs are made of. It's all dolomitic limestone, so very rich in calcium and magnesium. Okay. So we'd call it a calciphile, a plant that is absolutely required to have calcium in order to grow. And that's why we find it along the Niagara Escarpment. And you kind of know where to look for it based on those characteristics.
And then the walking fern must have similar requirements?
I think that they can range out a little more than that.
Oh, okay.
So walking fern isn't always a good indicator
Sure.
of it, but it's the best one that we have.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So other important things about the habitat are drainage. Heartsling fern are really susceptible to root rot. So that's why they grow on these slopes, we believe, and not in too much down in areas like this, because it's too wet down there.
There's
Because
better
the water
drainage
doesn't
on
drain off. Yeah.
Right.
So it seeps through all the cracks in the rocks and kind of rolls off. Propagating heartsling fern, American heartsling fern, is probably one of the most difficult ferns to propagate that I've read in every book that I've read on it. So it was a little daunting, you can imagine, when I came into that for my project, knowing that this was going to be like a hard thing to do. But yeah, root rot is one of the big issues that we have with it.
So how'd you do?
We did okay, yeah. We did all right. So it was funny, but one of my first things I had to do when I was a graduate student was invite a speaker to come to the campus and do a seminar on plant reintroduction. And we got this guy, great guy from Oregon, Tom Kay, who's a plant reintroduction specialist. He runs the Institute of Applied Ecology out in Corvallis, Oregon. We got him to come out, and he did a seminar. And here I am, a new grad student. I just did this thing. I was like, yeah, I got this guy to come out. It was great. First thing he says in his presentation is he's like, the one thing that plants love to do, or reintroduced plants love to do, is die. And you can imagine me sitting there, just like terror just came over me. I was like, oh, I'm getting into this like losing battle. But no, we did pretty well. And we found out a lot about it. I can maybe talk about that a little more in a moment. But to get back to the habitat, another significant thing about the habitat, the way these basins are shaped, they actually maintain a cooler microclimate in terms of the air temperature and higher humidity than any of the adjacent forests around it. So you get these areas where, and you'll notice, they only grow almost like mid-slope.
Right.
They don't really range down too much into the bottom.
Just get a few.
They don't really jump over the top of that cliff too much onto the flatter areas. They're so sensitive to climate, and that's one thing that we've never really been able to figure out. We have theories on why they're only at mid-slope and they don't go above or beyond. It definitely has something to do with the microclimate and probably the drainage.
Right.
And possibly snowpack as well, which is an interesting thing. But yeah, they're just a really mysterious plant. Despite all the research from Don Leopold and all we know about them, there's still elements that we don't. And this is probably one of the more well-studied plants in the area for an endangered or threatened species. And we still just has this air of mystery about it.
Now, this probably goes back to what you were saying before, how even in historical times when there was more habitat available, since it has such specific requirements, it was probably never a ubiquitous species.
No, it was probably more so though in the way back, like in the glacial age, because there are two. I forgot to mention there are two what I consider kind of relic populations in Tennessee and Alabama, and they exist down there in sinkholes, like cave sinkholes.
We did see that, right?
Alabama
in those southern areas. It's
right.
Just in those sinkholes.
Right. So my theory is that at one point they were more widespread and common back 10,000 years ago.
Right.
As the glaciers receded and the climate changed, they kind of got relegated to these areas like these sinkholes in Tennessee and Alabama and these plunge basins that we're in here right now, with these steep slopes. And they're almost always north-facing slopes too, because the south-facing slope will get too much sun, it'll dry out too quick.
Right.
So we know very specifically north to east facing slopes, 60-degree slope plus or minus, like calcareous talus slope, magnesium and calcium. Like we know all these things like to do it, but we still don't quite understand why. Like why in that particular spot, but why isn't that right over there too?
Right.
Like you look 50 feet to your right, there's none over there. It's like the same as over here. It's a really weird plant.
So you have some of the pieces, but not all of them yet.
Yeah, exactly. It always keeps you on your toes. Yeah.
That's great.
It's always more to learn.
Now, are there any species that reliably associate with it? Maybe like tree species or
calcium-loving species.
Yeah. I'm just trying to think what other connections there could be.
So typically, what you'd find in terms of the tree composition around them would be, not all that dissimilar from what we're seeing here. So we've got American basswood, We've got yellow birch. We usually have eastern hop hornbeam growing. Sugar maple obviously is a big one. Generally it would be like northeastern hardwood kind of forest type of species. We do occasionally have a mixed in eastern hemlock or so, but you'll notice around the base of the hemlock you don't see really any hart's tongue ferns growing around the base of it. There's a couple reasons for that, or a couple things that we believe about that anyways. Is that one, it's probably contributes to lowering the acidity of the soil around it, and they like circumneutral soils, we know, for the pH, and also it blocks snow from coming down and laying a blanket over them over the winter. So Syracuse, as some of you may know, is one of the snowiest, the snowiest city in the United States. Metropolitan area. So we get lots of snow. And part of that is thought to be really important in protecting the hart's tongue fern from our freezing temperatures in the winter, which we also enjoy.
Are they evergreen?
They are evergreen. So you'll see, so for instance on this one that's here, if you lift up the new fronds, you'll see remnants of the old fronds somewhere around here.
Okay.
This one's pretty buried, but some of them are more easy to see, like up in there. So they'll look like this, but more flattened in the spring, and they'll shoot up the new fronds with the old fronds still there. So they're like semi-evergreen, you could say. They persist under the snow, but then eventually over the course of the summer, the next year, they'll fade away.
The new set of leaves takes over.
Right. Oh yeah, so the hemlock with the snow, they block some of the snow coming down, so there's not as much cover from ice and freezing temperatures, and so that probably damages the ferns, especially when they're very small, when they're little sporelings, we call them. It's like the equivalent of a fern seedling is a sporling. And I have actually marked one off that I found up there. We can go take a look at that in a minute.
We have a pretty small one right down there. So is the one that you found even smaller than that?
Oh, much.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, much. So this would be considered an immature one because it's not producing spores yet. It takes them about 4 to 8 years to reach maturity. Wow. Very slow growing plant. That's one of the difficulties in propagating them too, is after 2 or 3 years, you've only got a plant that's like, a couple inches. They're not very big. And they can live, we don't know exactly how long they can live. That's weird not to know how long they can live for, but we estimate it's probably somewhere in the range of like 30 to 50 years, which isn't unusual for a lot of ferns.
Have we mentioned yet how long the average frond is? I don't think we have we?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
No, so you're probably looking at, for an average frond, this one that we're looking at here in front of us is a little smaller, I would say, than average for a mature one. But you're talking probably somewhere in the range of 40 to 60 centimeters. And the longest ones I found have been like 75, 80 centimeters. Sorry, I do everything in metric because that's just how we have to do it. So I don't know, what's the equivalent? Divide it by 2.54, and that's how many inches you got.
Sure.
Yeah, 20 to 25 inches, something like that. Yeah.
And this immature one, that's just a couple feet away from the one we're looking at. Those fronds, we would say, let's do it in inches. What would you say, 2-3 inches long?
Yeah, not more than 3 inches.
Yeah, you're probably looking at
2 inches.
8-9 centimeters, 2-3 inches, something like that.
Well, let's go look at the sporling.
Yeah, let's go take a look at the sporling.
Okay.
And watch your step, I guess.
Yeah, we're gonna go up diagonally here on the slope. So, and watch the rocks. Some of the rocks look stable, but they're not.
Oh, I was talking about trampling.
And also trampling. Yeah, any ferns. They're very sparse through here, though, so you should be okay. There's just one right here.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, as you can see, working on in this habitat is really difficult. The rocks are pretty loose. Sometimes, there's nowhere you can step without almost stepping on a hart's tongue fern in some of these spots. Right. So it's very careful surgical work that we do around here. So now I'm going to show you one of the sporelings. So I guess a little background on fern biology. So ferns reproduce by spores. We've been talking about that. But they don't just grow from the spore into the fern that you see. They start by producing a gametophyte, or a prothallus, which is basically just a little green structure, maybe about the size of your pinky nail. That's about a cell layer thick, or 2 cell layers thick. And on that structure, they have the sperm and the egg. And ferns require a film of water to reproduce. So a raindrop, a small puddle, something like that, a rock crevice in this case, will provide that water, and that's how the sperm swims to the egg, is when it's coated in a film of water. So what happens then is you get little ferns produced like that size. Yeah. So you can see this is growing right out of the rock.
That's
like,
about
it's
a quarter
on the rock.
inch. Yeah. Tiny.
And they're very, very small. Yep. So this would have been a new sporling produced this season. Wow. So this probably sprouted out from the gametophyte, from the egg, within the last month or two.
Wow.
Yeah. It's very tiny. So in the lab, when we would be growing these for our reintroduction project, we'd start them off in little petri dishes. We'd sterilize soil in them. You sow the spores over it. You get the gametophyte growing. In the lab, it takes about 90 days before you get a sporling.
Whoa.
Out here,
You gotta be pretty patient.
it's up for yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, fern growing is not as hard as a lot of people think. Maybe this fern is not the good one to start on, but it is a patient person's game for sure. You're not going to just put a seed in and have it sprout up to this big old plant in the course of a couple of months.
Right.
You're going to sow a spore. You're going to get a gametophyte in about 3 months. You're going to get a sporling in about 6 months, and it's going to be about this size, which is real tiny. And then, as you saw, the one that we had down there that looked probably like 4 years old, it only had fronds that were about 2-3 inches long. So it's a very, very patient person's game, and these ones are hard to keep alive for a long time. So, yeah. So it's a lot of very what's the term? Patient work. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But anyways, so we would grow them in petri dishes actually at ESF, and we would, when the gametophytes were mature, when we knew it had sperm and egg, we'd flood the dishes with water so that we knew the sperm was swimming around and hopefully crossbreeding with other gametophytes that were in the dish, and we get a little bit of genetic diversity going on, not selfing, so it's almost like self-pollinating if they were to do it on their own, and then we get these little guys growing.
So how long would you be growing them in a controlled environment before you transplant them?
That is an excellent question, and that was actually like the main focus of my thesis, was how long, what life stage do you have to grow them to before you can plant them out in the environment and get some kind of appreciable survival of them. So we did everything we did a pilot study where we just sowed spores out, didn't get any growth from that. When we came to the main part of the study, we partially germinated the spores, so they produce a little filament called a protonema. It's about 6-7 cells long, and we transplanted those in like these little rock crevices and things like that. We transplanted gametophytes themselves, so the little structure about the size of your pinky nail that has a sperm in the egg, we put them out when they were about mature and ready to reproduce. We transplanted sporelings, a little larger than that, but about 6 months, 8 months old, some of them a year or so old. And I should specify a sporling is basically just a young fern that's less than an inch in length of the frond. It's not really a life stage. It's just something that we created to differentiate it from the rest of them. And then we had plants that were grown for about 3 to 5 years. So I inherited those. I didn't,
I'm like long masters.
Yeah, those ones they started propagation and experimenting with all that before I started my master's. And I inherited a lot of those plants.
Good deal. Yeah.
Yes, that was nice. But I grew most of the younger ones myself, which was definitely easier than, I had to keep the other ones alive, which was tough. But, so we did that. And what we found was not only the longer you grew them, the better you did, but the older ones we divided into 2 separate categories. So there were ones that we attempted to acclimatize to the outdoor environment, to their natural environment, using a cold room in a greenhouse at ESF, and just changing the light regime and all that stuff. And then we took some and we put them outside in pots and overwintered them outside. And so not only do you have to grow them for 3 to 5 years before you get appreciable survival, you have to acclimatize them outdoors.
So the ones that you did in the room didn't do as well?
No, not at all. So that the ones that were outdoors acclimatized, we seeing somewhere on average about a 30 to 40% survival rate, which So, so I've given presentations for U.S. Fish and Wildlife because they're a big part of our project as well, being federally listed. And there was a like an animal biologist in the room, and she's like, "Oh, that sucks." Yeah, like 30%. I was like, "Oh no." I was like, "So with animals, yeah, that would probably suck."
Yeah.
I don't even know though. If you think about like birds, like what's their survival rate?
Yeah.
Well, let's
Yeah.
say past their first year.
Right.
Good luck,
Yeah.
mammologist or avian biologist.
Right. So yeah, what you would consider a success is really wide ranging depending
Sure.
on the species that you're working with.
Yeah.
So we're working with a species that's extremely climatically sensitive, has such really specific habitat requirements, and is just really like, we know a lot about it, but there's still something we can't put our finger on with it. So to get something around 30 to 40% survival, even if it's just in that one category, most of the other ones just all died for the most part. So now we know something about how to go about doing this properly. And I should mention that this isn't the first time that people have tried this. People have been trying to reintroduce hartstongue ferns since the 1920s because there was a population nearby that ended up being quarried, unfortunately.
Oh no.
Yeah, so there's a huge quarry not too far from here, about 2 miles long, that apparently was just as beautiful, had mirromictic lakes, like everything like we have here, like really awesome area. And apparently there were some of the biggest populations of hartstongue ferns in the state over there that I've read. They ended up transplanting some of those in here because they knew it was going to become a quarry. And so actually professors at Syracuse University, Dr. Mildred Faust, who I should mention, was a female botany professor and botanist at a time when most females weren't in it. Did a lot of work on the hartstongue fern. We owe her a great debt. She passed away in 1988 or so, but she did excellent work on the hartstongue fern. Was involved in a project where they transplanted them into Clark Reservation here in the 1930s, and none of them survived.
So adults don't do that well either. They have to be a certain young age.
They have, well, it really just depends on the, I think they might have just not put them in I read a report that said that they got washed away, like there was a rain event. So maybe they just didn't get them under the rock crevices right, and they got washed away. Yeah. And this and that. But they're, as a result of the quarrying, the Brooklyn Botanic Garden actually started propagating these. And they, perhaps against what we know now, but back then it wasn't really well known, they started sending them all over the country for people to plant them.
Oh, jeez.
Okay.
Yeah, so they were like, yeah, let's put these everywhere. And so, that would be not advisable now. We know what we know about invasive
Maybe they'd become invasive
and all
somewhere.
that. Yeah. So yeah, we wouldn't advise that now. But there was almost no data that was returned, and the data that was returned said that they died after the first winter. So we know the first winter is the important thing to get to.
Yeah.
With my survival, it was like straight down in terms of mortality or survival. It was just very low after that first winter, and then it kind of leveled off. So we saw not too much in losses after that first winter.
You can make it through that first winter, right?
Yeah,
That's the important thing. But this has been attempted, the propagation and reintroduction of hartstongue fern, at least 4 times in the past, and with no successful results or with no data to back up any kind of claim.
Yeah, that's tough.
So your effort has been the best.
Yeah. We did it. Yeah. Not all my effort, though. I had a lot of help along the way.
And a 30% success rate.
Yes, he had a 30% success rate. But now we know what we didn't get any information from in the past is why it didn't work or why it did work. So now we have that knowledge. We can then take that and move on to the next phases of it. And we do plan on continuing propagation. There is actually ongoing propagation happening at SUNY ESF right now. And that project will be transitioned over to parks sometime within the next year.
And will you have a hand in that then?
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
Great.
So we mentioned Mary Clark Thompson earlier and her involvement with here and with Sonnenberg Gardens. So my former advisor for my master's, Danny Fernando, is currently running propagation at ESF, and he's going to transition that project over to, parks, but essentially me. And Bridget from the previous episode that you did at Sonnenberg Gardens as part of the plant materials program for parks. We're going to be propagating them at the Sonnenberg Gardens greenhouses there for reintroduction probably 3 to 5 years from now after their outdoor acclimatization. Yeah, it's going to be a long project, but we've got the backing of Fish and Wildlife, New York Natural Heritage Program, SUNY ESF,
nice.
that's one thing about plant reintroduction that a lot of people aren't familiar with. You think you just grow a plant, you put it out there, and it doesn't matter. Like, that's just it. But it takes a long time to do it right, and you have to have buy-in, not only from the agencies that you're working with, but also from the public. You know, sometimes the public doesn't just want people growing plants and putting them out there and this and that, and you know, so it's really important that we get that feedback from people, and that we have our partners on board, and that everyone's with it. So we're not just out here rogue agents, you know, doing whatever we want, like had been done in the past.
Yeah.
You know, because we know that leads to problems with, is this a natural population?
Right.
Is this a transplanted population? So I keep my records up to date with, you know, all the appropriate people, so that they know what I'm doing and I know what they're doing, and we're all copacetic.
And I think that's why, you know, Whitney, who, I don't know if she's directly your boss, but the one who put us in touch with you and who got in touch with us originally, was one of her big reasons for doing it is to let the public know what's going on.
Right.
Because New York State Parks, being a park agency, they don't have a big marketing budget or, you know, a way to let lots of people know about the good work they're doing with plant propagation and reintroductions and all the other great stuff they're doing. But we're happy to play our little small part in spreading the word. But I think this is a good point at which we can tell people, if they want to support this work, if they want to find out more about this work, how can they do that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So to find out more about it, recently I wrote a blog post for the New York State Parks blog that gives a little bit of history of the discovery of the fern in New York State, and kind of what Parks is currently doing with the fern, etc. So you can find information on that there. Soon it will be at Sonnenberg Gardens being propagated, so you could go there probably in a year or two, and visit them and see them there, which is probably the only time you'll be able to see them, because not too many people, well, we legally can't disclose the locations of these because they're federally protected, so not too many people get to see them. So that'll be your chance to see them probably within a couple years from now.
So this is fall.
So write it down. Yeah.
This is fall 2018, folks.
Yeah.
So in fall 2020?
Yeah, you might see some ferns growing there. We'll probably get it up and running within the next year, and so we'll do that. But we're also planning right here at Clark Reservation in our nature center, which is a great resource that we have by our parking lot here. We're planting a terrarium with hart's tongue fern, where you'll be able to see all the different life stages. So you'll be able to see the little gametophytes. You'll be able to see the little sporelings.
Cool.
And some of the older plants. That'll obviously take a little while too, because they're so slow growing. Yeah. But we're getting a nice Victorian style Wardian case or terrarium. And we're going to have some nice signage and interpretive information. In order to get involved, like physically involved, you can always follow a few rules at parks. So the best stewards of our parks, the best way to be involved is just to follow the rules, stay on the trail, don't throw garbage, things like that is excellent. And if you feel like you want to do more than just be a good visitor to the park, you can always contact parks, specifically through the Forces program. So that's Friends of Recreation, Conservation, and Environmental Stewardship, and offer to volunteer. We do a lot of invasive species management, so we come out with trowels and we're kind of surgical out here, you know, because it's really tough to work in. We dig out, you know, the invasive species. We do education programs, all that stuff. I twice a year or so I do a fern hike. So if you want to come along on that, I probably won't do another one this year, but maybe next year keep your eye out for it at Clark Reservation State Park.
So the Forces program that you mentioned, Mike, that's specific to New York State, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's actually a New York State Parks specific program.
Yeah, so any of our listeners outside New York State, obviously you can contact your state parks, get involved. They have similar programs, similar volunteer opportunities. It's always good to get involved in your local state parks if you want to feel a connection to your local environment. Yeah. All right, so why don't we move?
Yeah.
So we can move down to a place with a little more secure footing?
Yeah.
All right. All right. So Mike, I think a good place to wrap up would be to say, you know, if a person asks, why bother with this plant? Its range is so restricted. Most people are not ever going to run into this plant. How would you answer someone who says, why bother? Why bother put all this work into it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's something that when you're so close to a topic like this, sometimes you forget that not everyone is as passionate or knows as much about it as you do. So the why bother question is a really good one. my best response to that in terms of this particular species, the hartstongue fern, is that it exists in these areas that are so rare and significant. The habitats here, you don't find these everywhere. And there's valuable natural resources that exist within the habitats as well, particularly limestone. So one of the reasons why bother is because if we didn't do this, if we didn't protect these plants or these areas, then basically you might end up with just a bunch of big pits in the ground that are kind of ugly. and it's great brick and mortar. I'm not against that stuff. But to do it in a way that doesn't affect these rare and significant communities, that once they're gone forever. I've done the habitat research. I've looked in the area. There's not many places that you can't just move these. I don't want to get the impression that because we can grow them and transplant them that it's easy to do. It's really not, and there's not a lot of places for them to go. So it's really important for us to protect these simply because it's the only bits of them that are left. We've quarried up a lot of them. We've moved into areas and this and that. So we kind of have, as human beings, a responsibility to now start taking care of these areas that, otherwise might just end up a big pit in the ground.
Yeah.
And we did, in our limited research that we did, the literature we looked at said that populations, even though they're very limited, they are relatively stable. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Although the caveat to that is that some of the populations, particularly the ones that are on private lands in New York State, tend to have a lot of invasive species. Right. So pale swallowwort in particular is one that most people are familiar with. That's a really nasty, aggressive, invasive vining plant. And so the ones like this that we're at now is definitely stable. This is a big, healthy population. But some of the populations in New York State are as few as 8, 10, 15 plants.
Wow.
And if you get swallowwort and other things coming in there, like there's no management of the land because they're on private land or wherever, then I would argue that we're probably more at risk of losing some of these populations now than we ever have been because of that issue. And that's something that is being addressed with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. They actually have private landowner, like land management programs for people that have rare, threatened, endangered species on their property, and that gives them advice and guidance on how to manage their properties.
Great.
Well, and so they're working on things like that right now.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, Mike, we want to say thank you again for sharing your time, your knowledge with us and the audience. We appreciate it, and we hope you'll come back on sometime.
Yeah, you're welcome, guys. Thanks for coming out and checking out our little corner of the world here.
Yeah, thank you.
Our pleasure. Yeah.
All right, so we hope you enjoyed the episode.
And we want to give a big thank you to Mike for giving up his time, his expertise. You can just tell this man's a natural teacher.
Yeah, no, it was really great.
It was great. We also want to thank our contact at New York State Parks, Whitney Carlton, for putting us in touch with Mike and all the other great people that she works with. And we definitely hope she'll be putting us in touch with more people in the future.
Yeah, looking forward to what they're doing, in the near future.
Yeah.
All right, so first and foremost, we'd like to thank our growing list of Patreon supporters. So thank you, Sarah, Rachel Liffam, the drunk phytologist.
I like it.
Yeah, and welcome back, Mountain Misery Farms.
Hey, welcome back. I'm glad they came back.
So we're thankful for every single patron, but at the end of every show, we like to give a special thanks to our top patrons. Rob, we named the dog Indy, Orange Julian, and especially Ken, Diane, Alyssa, Morgan, Elizabeth, Daniel, and Susan.
Thank you, folks.
Yeah, we also need to thank our recent PayPal donors. So thank you very much, Jerry, Cheryl, and Amanda. Thank you guys so much. Those were incredibly generous donations.
Yes,
so
thank you
very
folks.
much.
It was a very wonderful surprise.
Yeah.
We also want to thank our new 5-star reviewer on iTunes. So thank you, Devil Chaser. And I also want to thank our reviewers on Stitcher from the last year, since we always seem to forget them. So
yeah, sorry guys.
So thank you, MK710, Julie DD, and Mark Nenadov.
Yeah, so keep those reviews coming, guys. It really helps us get the word out to more people. Now, I want to say life's been super busy, and I forgot to get in touch with Always Wondering Art for our normal beautiful thumbnail.
Oh, okay.
But as always, their website and Etsy page will be in the episode notes.
Yes.
So you guys get a free one. All right, and as we said before, please go check out gumleafusa.com, and we have links in the episode notes and on our website. And remember to check out the great work that Mike and New York State Parks are doing at Clark Reservation State Park.
Yeah, it's a great place to go and visit.
Yeah, so if you have any of your own questions, comments, or episode suggestions, send us an email at thefieldguides@gmail.com. Visit us on Instagram at FieldGuidesPodcast, follow us on Twitter at FieldGuidesPod, like and follow us on Facebook, and visit our website at thefieldguidespodcast.com. And if you like what you hear and you want to support the podcast, you can do so on patreon.com/thefieldguides. But if you're like me and you can't afford to financially support a podcast right now, there are other ways you can help out. You can share our episode with friends or rate us and leave a review on iTunes or Stitcher. It really helps us get the word out to more people. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you next month.
See you next month, folks.